Okay, let's make a start. So, hopefully you are in here because you're wanting to hear about toddlers and under fives ministry. I think I put as the first sentence in the blurb as why is it important to nurture faith with our toddlers? And that sentence for me evokes this kind of picture. If you can move on to the next slide. This kind of a picture of nurturing a little seedling of faith that we're carefully tending to. But I want to start by emphasising that perhaps our ministry is actually serving an earlier stage than this. And it's important to be conscious and intentional of what our calling is and what our vision is in each of our contexts. So I don't necessarily want the takeaway of this workshop to be, how can we gradually shoehorn in more faith into our toddler groups? That might be what God is calling you to do, in which case listen and respond to that call. But I also want us to have a broader view of what nurturing spirituality might be. So to borrow loosely from the parable of the sower, it might be our first stage, it might be that we are ministering with children who have a seed of faith, like this one in the picture, that we're gently nurturing it, watering it, helping it to grow. If you could move 2 spots on. Thank you. So it might be that we're planting the seed, that we're introducing faith, we're introducing Jesus to a child or to a family who would not yet identify as Christian. Or if we can see the third one, perhaps it's even earlier in the process. Perhaps we're preparing the soil. Perhaps we're removing the weeds, adding compost to create a nourishing environment. I'm not much of a gardener. My point is that at this stage, at this last stage, we might not even be mentioning God or Jesus or prayer or Bible stories, but we can still nurture the foundations of faith by creating an environment where it has space to grow. You may already know which of these God is calling you to in your context. Or perhaps you don't, and in which case this might be a good moment to ask him. But I think it's important to be realistic and intentional about what our vision or our calling is for this moment, for this particular group, and to respond accordingly. If we could move on to our next slide, please. We're going to come back to this nurturing environment, but I want to start first of all with toddler groups. I imagine that many of us here are involved with leading or with supporting toddler groups, and they are a huge blessing to the communities that we serve. And according to research, admittedly this is pre-pandemic research, but over 55% of churches in England, so more than half, offered a toddler group. And it is the most commonly offered community group by churches, closely followed by youth groups. But I think there's often a perception that it's just the toddler group, and it's fairly disconnected from the church. I'm not sure that the words toddler and ministry appear in the same sentence a huge amount. And to be honest, when I was trying to do some reading and research for this workshop, I couldn't find huge amounts. And so I think we, as the church, probably not us as individuals, because you've chosen to come to this workshop, but I think we as the church don't tend to think of toddlers as being particularly spiritual beings whose faith can be nurtured. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir, or to the toddler group leaders here. I know that you know the importance of ministry for under fives, but let's remind ourselves for some of the reasons. So on to the next slide. Why do we do it? This pie chart comes from a report by the Church of England Education Office, and researchers asked adult practicing Christians, at what age they felt that they had come to faith. And 40% of adult Christians said that they came to faith under the age of 5. 76% were under the age of 18, but 40% were under 5. Under 5. So toddlers aren't too young for faith. Statistically, that's when they're most likely to come to faith. It's huge. And I assume, I do know people who have vivid memories of accepting Jesus at the age of 3 or 4, but I assume that most respondents in that 40%, what they were actually saying was, I don't remember ever not being a Christian. My faith has always been part of me. In which case, it's super important that toddlers are able to feel part of the church and to feel part of the faith, to identify and own that they belong here. So on to our next slide. Let's look at our reach as toddler groups. So again, pre-pandemic, but according to More Than Sundays report, which is 2009, so a little bit old, but about 52% of under 4s attend a church-led toddler group. I struggle to believe that we have contact with 52% of any other age group. Surely this is the age in life when people are most likely to come into contact with the church. As I say, 2009 is quite a long time ago data-wise, but newer research done in February 2020 says that 74% of all parents with children under the age of 5 have attended a church activity in the last 12 months. Again, the type of activity, toddler groups was number 1, preschool play groups was number 2. I'm sure that COVID has had an impact on those statistics to an extent, but this is the most up-to-date data available. So on 25% of parents who haven't had any contact with church or with church-led activity in the last year, a really high proportion of them, I want to say it was something like 84%, I can't remember, a really high number of that 25% said that they would like to go to church if they were invited. So that's the context of the sort of reach that we have and the sort of contact that we have with under 5s and their families. So on to the next slide, please. We absolutely know that young children can have faith and that we have a surprisingly big reach to toddlers, both, quote, churched and unchurched. But we also recognise that a child's faith is different to an adult's faith. One of my favourite Bible verses is from right at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, after the sort of the love is patient, love is kind bit. At the end of that passage, it says, "When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." I know that Paul is not talking about toddler ministry here, and that actually we're the children in that analogy. But I think he makes a good point nonetheless. Even as adults, we're not expected to fully understand the whole faith and God thing. We know in part, we see a dim reflection. So it is right and good that children understand in a childish way. They talk in a childish way, that they think in a childish way. We don't need them to understand in full. They'll get there as they grow. So to understand a bit more about the context for children's faith, we're going to just remind ourselves of where children under 5 are developmentally, and we're going to look at a few key theorists. We've got about 10 minutes of sort of theory now, which some of you might be familiar with, some of you might not be. None of these theories are perfect, but as a broad stroke, I think they're quite helpful. So if we could move on to the next slide. So we're going to start with cognitive development, which is all about developing thought. If you could move it on. Piaget. Oh, and again, sorry. Thanks. So we're going to start with Jean Piaget, and his first sort of couple of stages. The first stage is the sensoromotor stage, which is sort of birth to 18 months or 2 years. By the way, you're welcome to ask me for the slides afterwards if that's useful. Drop me an email. So this stage is all about exploring the world around us, and we do that mostly through our senses and through movement. Whether that's through touching things, through tasting things. I don't know if you can see that the baby here has a spoon in their mouth. Through seeing, through hearing, they're learning and they're making sense of the world around them. Through touch, through sort of manipulating things. One of the first things that they learn about is sort of their place in the world. So they learn that they're a separate being, that they're separate, for example, from their caregivers, that they're not the same person. And they also discover object permanence. So understanding that objects exist even if I can't see them. So if you put my favourite toy behind a cushion, I know it's still there. And eventually I'll even develop the skill to problem solve and actually move the cushion out of the way to get to my toy. Similarly, if mum or dad or anybody else leaves the room, I know that they're coming back because they're a permanent object, even if I can't see them. Onto the next stage is the pre-operational stage. So this is roughly 2 to 7. So thinking of the sort of the first half of this stage, children are starting to think symbolically, and they're learning to use words and pictures to represent objects. So we're thinking about early speech, early reading, writing, drawing. They're also developing the skills for pretend play. But they still think of the world around them in fairly concrete and self-centred terms. They can't necessarily deploy logic yet, and they see the world from their own perspective. They can't put themselves into somebody else's shoes, which, if you have ever tried to reason with a toddler, you're probably aware of that. They can't see things from other people's perspective yet. On to the next slide, please. And we have psychosocial development. On to the next one. I think it's probably 2. Again, thank you. We've got Erik Erikson, and we're going to look at 3 stages from him. So the first age is 0 to 18 months, 2 years or so. And he calls each of the stages sort of by two qualities. And so if you complete the stage successfully, you get one quality, and if you don't, then it might be the other quality. So the first stage is trust versus mistrust. So in this stage, babies are learning, is my world safe? Are my needs met? And can I rely on my caregivers? So they're either learning to develop trust of the world around them, learning that they feel safe and secure, or if they're not getting that, then perhaps they're learning mistrust of the world. Perhaps they're learning that the world is not a safe place. On to the next one. 2 to 3 years is autonomy versus shame. Apologies, I've put it the wrong way around on there.
this is quite similar to the Montessori idea of I can do it myself. This stage is about gaining control, about being able to make choices, for example, about what they want to eat, what they want to wear, what they want to play with, potty training. They are learning that they are individuals, that they can make decisions, and developing a degree of independence. If it's not going so well, and the autonomy is squashed, then they might be learning shame, that they're not good enough, that they're not to be trusted to make their own decisions or to become their own person. And then on to the final stage from Erikson, initiative versus guilt, which is 3 to 5 years old. So taking the I can do it myself a little bit further, is developing a sense of taking charge. So perhaps that's making up a game and assigning other people roles in the game. It's about starting to explore being a leader, or perhaps following a leader. And with that, they're experiencing planning and compromise. So it's all at this stage is all about learning to play or to work with others, and sort of generating that relationship with others. If successful, they develop a sense of initiative and purpose. So I can organise not just myself, but actually I can organise other people as well. If unsuccessful, then they may develop a sense of guilt. Let's move finally onto faith development. And again, if you could put 2 on, thank you. So first of all, John Fowler does a huge amount of research into faith development, and his first stage, actually I think it's stage 0, confusingly, he starts with primal faith. So again, this is on birth up to 2. This is quite similar to Erikson, which we've just heard. Again, it's about, am I safe? Am I nurtured? And extending beyond the immediate caregivers to make that transferable to, can I trust God? If I know that I can trust my caregivers, then I know that I can trust God. If I know that I can't trust my caregivers, what basis do I have to trust God? His next stage is intuitive projective faith. And this is, if you could put it onto the next slide, thank you. For 2 to 3 year olds, 3 to 7 year olds. And in this stage, it has a lot in common with Piaget. So recognising that children don't have much capacity for reasoning or for abstract thought, abstract ideas yet. And they're not great at thinking beyond themselves. So they learn through experiences. They learn through stories, through images, through the people they meet, which includes us. And last of all, we have John Westerhoff. Again, if you could put it, thank you. Who sadly died in the last couple of days, actually. So John Westerhoff has 4 stages of faith, and the first of those is experienced faith. So like Fowler, this isn't a reasoned faith or even an understood faith. It's a faith that children experience, and we experience it through joining in customs and rituals, by being at church services, by, walking to the front at communion time, if that's something that you do in your church, by doing the same things that the grown-ups do. We feel like we belong because we're doing the same actions as everybody else. And by participating in them, we come to believe that those actions and the faith that they represent are meaningful and important. That's all of the theory done. On to the next slide. What does this mean? What does it mean when it comes to nurturing faiths in our under 5s? I think it's somehow both simpler and more complicated than it seems. For under fives, to be honest, we're not necessarily trying to get them to understand salvation and to accept Jesus as their Lord and Saviour. Sure, all of us might well know 3-year-olds who are there. And I'm not saying that they can't do that. They absolutely can. But what I'm saying is that those children are probably the exception rather than the norm. And that if our 3-year-olds aren't there, it's not because we're doing anything wrong. What we're trying to do is keep children on that path towards faith and to enable them to progress through the normal development stages to a place where they can live a life of conscious, chosen faith and relationship with God. So we're trying to keep them on that normal path of development at whatever stage, whatever pace is appropriate for them. But we're trying to keep them on that pathway of healthy development. So the things that we can do to encourage that, whatever our context, are to cultivate spaces where, first of all, children feel secure and safe and loved. Second of all, where they're able to explore safely, where they can explore the world around them. And thirdly, where they are able to develop independence and to make choices. What this maybe doesn't look like, I don't want to be negative, but what this maybe doesn't look like, if you can move on to the next slide, please, is an environment where we're having to say no all the time. Perhaps because there are objects in reach that aren't safe or that they aren't allowed to touch. We don't want an environment where we give them lots of stern looks because they're being too loud or because they're not playing the way that we think that they should. Where we're making choices for them by providing a craft and ensuring they do it the correct way. Because we can't have a sheep that's blue and the legs have to be in the right place. They can't be coming out of the ears. We don't want to be stifling their sense of independence, taking control and doing things for them or helping them to be quicker. That doesn't work perfectly all the time, obviously. These things are always going to happen. Sometimes we really do need to help them to be quicker. And I'm not here to make you feel guilty for saying no to the 3-year-old who wants to paint the floor instead of the table or whatever. But you get my gist. Safe, secure, loved, safe to explore, supported in making decisions, developing independence, and feeling like they belong. Those are the things that we are aiming for. This is the soil that we're trying to cultivate. And like I said at the start, this is the soil that will nourish faith and give it the best chance of growing when a seed is planted in it. And arguably the bottom section of the weeds that we're trying to keep down. So let's look at some practical ways that we might nurture faith. I imagine that all of us are here for different reasons. Some of us, it's because you're involved in running a church-run toddler group and are looking to introduce faith to otherwise sort of non-church-going families. Some of you, I'm sure, are involved in running a creche or similar groups as sort of part of a Sunday service provision. Some of you might be here because you have under fives in your life, children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whoever they are. Maybe you're here for a different reason. We're going to take a look at 3 different contexts. Not every example will be appropriate for every situation, so I encourage you just to take the bits that are relevant to you and leave the bits that aren't. So on to the next slide. Thank you. Sorry, I realise this is all a bit small when it's on a screen this size. Faith at home. Studies consistently show that the biggest impact on faith is family. So the most likely way that our children are going to be learning faith is actually not at church, it's at home. And that makes sense. So as Rachel Turner points out here, this is a really good book, by the way, if you want to look more into nurturing faith with babies and toddlers, particularly ones that you live with. Rachel Turner's book is really good. So she points out that the reasons why family will have a big impact on faith is, first of all, our children probably like us more than other people. And they like us the best. Second of all, our children spend more time with us than they do with other people. That's certainly true if we're running, a Sunday morning group. And third of all, our children live their everyday lives with us. I think it's worth noting, in my experience, the most popular toys at toddler groups are always the Hoover, the vacuum, the iron. Watched a child this week with a little dustpan and brush going around. They like to copy us. They want to be like us. And so if we model faith, they will copy us. So when it comes to sharing our own faith at home, if you could move the slide on, Rachel makes these suggestions, and she goes into more detail in her book. First of all, model talking to God, and model listening to God too. So model talking to God and model listening to God. It doesn't have to be the complicated words. It can be just talking to God about how I'm feeling right now, whether that's a good feeling or a bad feeling. But modeling talking to God about how we're feeling and what we're thinking about. Second of all, she talks about allowing children to be part of our faith, like Westerhoff's experienced faith. Involve them in it, whether that's, I don't know, if you have time for sort of reading the Bible for 10 minutes whilst they're playing in the same room, perhaps that works, perhaps that doesn't. But allow children to be part of our faith. I don't know, like listening to worship music or praying or whatever it is, but the ways that faith sort of plays into our life in a daily way, to involve children in that. And finally, she talks about weaving spirituality into the ordinary, not just at church. So don't save it for Sundays or for bedtimes or for when we're in the church building. Notice God in the everyday, in the world around us, and share that. On to the next slide. So some of us may not have children at home, but we are in the position of nurturing faith in a church context, or in an explicitly faith-based context at least. So, as we've just said, customs and rituals are really important. So welcoming children into church, including them in the service. When we share the peace, or where we go up for communion, or whatever sort of rituals are part of your church services, but involving children in them. Can we facilitate them joining in? So joining in with hymns or songs. If they're too young to be able to read the words or say the words, can we do things with actions, or can we involve instruments? My director of music does not like that. Or ribbons. And even, to be honest, we had a child who was probably about 2 or 3 at the time, it was pre-pandemic, who loves singing, doesn't know any of the words of the hymns, and so he sat there singing the words of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to the tune of whatever hymn it was that we were singing. But that was great, and yeah, encourage joining in. It doesn't matter if they don't know the words. And also sharing stories. It doesn't matter if they don't understand the stories, but sharing stories, sharing Bible stories. I caught the end of Hugh Thomas's workshop and hear about sharing stories. I only know that Hugh says he doesn't like Bible stories for children and prefers the Good News Bible. Notwithstanding that, I do. If you do like children's Bibles, I've got 1 or 2 you can have a look at. But share stories, even if they don't fully understand that. And actually, you'd be surprised at the links that children start to make. My favourite story about this, and apologies if I've told it to you before, because I tell it a lot, was doing the story of Jesus talking about the good shepherd and that the good shepherd protects his sheep, and the good shepherd drives away the wolf, and doing this with a group that had 3-year-olds in it, and one of them sort of thought about it and said, "Did the wolf go back to the pigs?" What are you talking about? Did the wolf, when it ran away, did it go back to the 3 little pigs' house? Yeah. Oh, you made it. But she's who knows how much of that story she got, but she's making the links. She understands how the wolf fits in. Understands that the wolf is is sort of the antagonist in both those stories as well. So even if they don't fully understand it, those stories are going in. They're sort of setting a foundation. And if you can move on to the next slide. Belonging and safety, so sort of borrowing from what Erickson and Fowler were saying. It's important to create places where children belong and where they feel safe. So a safe space to play, and also to play engagingly. Thinking of some children's corners in churches. Again, there's a big book about children's corners in churches. Somewhere that they can play safely, that they can play engagingly. Ideally somewhere that they're not going to be shushed constantly. I realise that's a challenge. And perhaps that, I love all age, I love intergenerational worship, I think it's so important. But if that means that children are just going to be shushed all the time, perhaps that's an argument for creating a space where they're not going to be shushed, sort of next to the worship area. Allowing them to be themselves, to be independent, to be creative, the creative beings that they are, that they've been created to be. And finally, it's important for them to be able to feel a part of community, and that where they are, that they can be welcomed fully as they are. Again, I appreciate that's not always the easiest on Sunday mornings. However much we try, sometimes it's just not possible. But can we offer a community something like Messy Church or Family Worship or Toddler Praise, where they are fully welcomed and provided for as part of that community? Again, if you're interested in all of this, this book by Rebecca Nye on children's spirituality is a really good read if you want to sort of delve more into that. She was keynote speaker, I think last time they were at Philadelphia, so maybe it was 2019, she was the keynote speaker for Joined Up. Is really good on children's spirituality. So on to our next slide. Finally, perhaps we are not yet at the stage of nurturing a seedling, but we're just tending to the soil. At the risk of stretching the analogy too thin, I think that parents or carers are an important component in the soil. Because at the end of the day, if faith is best learnt at home, for all the reasons that Rachel Turner described, then we need to nurture and encourage and nourish parents in faith just as much as the children. So, when that comes to active Christians, that's how the research termed it, not necessarily my phrase. But talking about active Christians, that might be it might be that they're interested in parenting for faith, which is an organisation. It's part of BRF, I think. They are running courses specifically for parents of babies and toddlers later in the year. If parents aren't at that stage yet, perhaps an alpha course is going to be more appropriate. One that's accessible for parents, so perhaps it's in the daytime, or perhaps it has a creche, or perhaps it's on Zoom, so they don't have to leave the house. Whatever it is that's going to work for your parents. Even if they're not at the stage of praying themselves, perhaps we can ask for prayer requests. was looking at on one of the toddler group networks the other week. There was somebody who had a prayer request teapot. I don't know why it's a teapot, but it was, it was novel. And parents know that they can put a piece of paper into the teapot and that they will be prayed for. Or others had like a phone number, but I think it was a separate phone number, so it could remain relatively anonymous. But that's a gentle way that we can show parents, this is part of our faith as Christians. We pray, and this is a way of us showing that we care for you, is by praying for you. So perhaps we can invite them to be prayed for, even if they're not at the stage of being able to pray themselves. And finally in that section is we can model prayer and worship. I think a lot of people perhaps now, a lot of young parents haven't had much experience of prayer or of worship, and they wouldn't even know where to start if they wanted to. So when we say a prayer together at the end of toddler group, or when we sing a simple song about God, that's modelling that we don't need fancy words to speak to God, and that he meets us in the simplest of ways, and that he meets us at the level of a child, whoever we are, wherever we are. So even just by saying a prayer together at the end of toddler group, especially if it's one that we do quite regularly, that's something that they can take home and be able to use in their daily lives. And as I said right at the start, maybe we're not in a place where explicit expressions of faith feel like the right step at the moment. There are plenty of reasons why you might have a toddler group that doesn't use prayers, that doesn't use Christian songs. That doesn't mean that God isn't present and working in that group. And even there, we can be nurturing parents. If you could move it on to the next slide. So we can be nurturing parents by creating a space to develop friendships at toddler groups, where they can share the ups and the downs, the mundanity with other parents or other grandparents, friends who are living the same experience at the same time. We can facilitate community. I know certainly one or two of the toddler groups that I've been involved in have had sort of entire NCT groups that arrive and continue through. Or also the relationship between the grandparent-aged helpers that come, particularly if children's grandparents perhaps don't live in the same city, or they don't get to see a huge amount of them, then developing those sort of relationships with different generations and having contact with people of different generations is really valuable. Genuine sharing and remembering and following up. So, having a conversation one week about something that's difficult, remembering to ask about that the next week, and remembering to check in is a way of genuinely nurturing parents. Also, perhaps parenting courses. There's parent talk. I think for primary age and teenage, mostly at the moment, but perhaps that's something that would be useful where you are. And finally, serving in quite a practical, resource-based way. So perhaps it's about having a library of books where children can take books away and bring them back. Or perhaps it's about having clothes swaps every so often. Or perhaps it's the simple things like making sure that you have spare nappies in the sort of baby change in the toilets for anyone who either hasn't brought enough spares, doesn't have enough spares, who needs some. And also, whether this might be appropriate where you are, is the sort of expert drop-ins. So I know that some toddler groups have had sort of health visitors visiting them, particularly when health visitors haven't been able to get around to people's houses as much over the last couple of years. But having people come into toddler group. So there are some ideas some ideas of how we might nurture the children and their families. If you can move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk through these and then I'm going to give you time to reflect. So having a quick look at resources that might help us. I've divided these into sort of faith-centred, family-centred and social or development-centred. Some of them could really be in all three groups. But starting at the top, in the family-centred resources, Care for the Family has lots and lots of stuff on it. So they're worth a look. There's Parent Talk, which I've already mentioned, which off the top of my head I think is related to Care for the Family. Parenting for Faith, which I've mentioned. Who Let the Dads Out, so around men, fathers, male sort of father figures. Kids Matter, who I think have a stall in the marketplace. Kitchen Table Project, who have a stall in the marketplace. And then going down this sort of supporting social and sort of development. So these are things that don't necessarily have a faith component, but where we're tending to the soil. So there's Get Out, which is outside with toddlers, which was developed. For the pandemic, really, but it's. I don't think you can see it on here, but the tagline underneath is "Let nature nurture your little ones." So it's about getting outside. I think it's provided by the Salvation Army. Having baby and toddler groups. It's one that you're probably already involved in. And I've also put up here Sam's Space, which is at Firth Park Methodist Church, where they have converted part of the building into a soft play area. Obviously, this is not something that every church would be able to do, but I think there are an increasing number of churches that have either sort of a soft play thing or maybe a cafe. My point is providing something that's not sort of explicitly faith-based, but is a way of sort of meeting a need and serving families in the community. And then there's the faith-centred things. So you have almost certainly heard of Messy Church. I suspect you've also heard of Muddy Church as well, so being outside. There's Diddy Disciples, which is all about like faith on a Sunday morning, following the lectionary. I've got the two books here if that's something you're interested in and you want to have a look at. They're down here. Wonderfully Made, which I think is about faith, introducing faith, and it is for use in a toddler group. Bible Buds, similarly, is a kind of Christian program for the year. That is all of them. So I think we have about 15 minutes left. So I would like to encourage you to have a think, perhaps on your own, but perhaps with the people around you. What is one thing that you want to take home today? Perhaps it's a practical idea, perhaps it's a principle or a thought. It doesn't have to be something that I've said, it can be a thought that has come to you. But what is it that you want to take home today? If you'd like to have a talk with the people around you, if you don't fancy talking and you want to come and have a look at some books or ask me a question, then you're welcome to do so. But let's, if we do that for about 10 minutes, and then we can share for the last couple of minutes. Thank you. We do technically have a few minutes till lunchtime, but I'm aware that there are a lot of people moving around at the back, and that if we finish a couple of minutes early, we can get to lunch. Is there anything that anybody, I don't know, feels that they really want to share?
Actually just chatting to Philippa, and we were saying, like, my kids haven't been in church for whatever it was, 18 months, nearly 2 years, and they don't know how to behave in church anymore. And so when we're inviting church, other kids in, that it's so easy to kind of think, oh, they're not behaving very well or whatever, when actually they're just being kids. It's normally a lovely big space that they can And I'm the one, other parents going, oh no, their kids are behaving really badly, and I'm the one saying, no, they're fine, don't, let them run around like mad things, it's big space. And I'm trying to sit on my kids, therefore, and kind of trying to make them stop. So I have to try and disconnect and say, no, they're being kids, and they love church, they want to be in that building, they love all the people, they love that everyone gives them biscuits, They feel safe, they feel welcome, but they also like to tear around like loonies. But it's remembering that kids are kids, and if they feel safe, they're going to be themselves.
I always find the other problem is that church has great acoustics. Like, they're designed to have good acoustics, and they make the best noise when it's quiet, because you can hear your noise then. Right. Thank you so much for being here. We'll finish a couple of minutes early if we can. Thank you, and my prayers with you as you go and serve the under fives in wherever you are.